Celeste's voice was rising towards stardom when she suddenly vanished, and months later D4vd shocked the world by releasing hit songs that carried her haunting vocals, songs recorded long after she was gone. Celeste had always been described as different, not because of how she looked or dressed, but because of her voice. It was the kind of sound that could silence a crowded room in seconds, carrying both fragility and strength in equal measure. Growing up in a small town, she poured her emotions into music, uploading songs late at night to streaming platforms where a small but loyal group of listeners began to gather. Her tracks weren't polished or heavily produced, but they carried a raw beauty that seemed impossible to imitate. She sang about loneliness, about longing, about a darkness that lingered just beneath her words. To her fans, she was on the edge of becoming something bigger, someone whose voice could define a generation. But before she could take that step into the spotlight, she vanished without a trace. Her disappearance was quiet at first, almost overlooked. A few friends posted worried messages online after she failed to show up to a recording session, but the story never reached the national news. People assumed she had stepped away from music or needed space, as so many young artists do. Only those closest to her noticed the chilling silence that followed. Celeste had always been consistent about updating her fans, and the sudden stop in her uploads was deeply unusual. Weeks passed, and the small group that cared about her absence began to fear the worst. Still, without hard evidence or media pressure, her case lingered in the shadows, pushed aside by bigger headlines and louder voices. Then, almost quietly, her voice began to resurface in a way no one could explain. A rising star named D4vd, known for moody, atmospheric tracks, released new music that quickly caught fire online. The songs were instantly praised for their haunting quality, layered with an ethereal female voice in the background. Fans were drawn to the strange beauty of the sound, calling it unlike anything they had ever heard before. But to those who had followed Celeste, the voice was not new at all, it was hers. The realization spread slowly at first, with people comparing clips and digging through old recordings. The resemblance was undeniable. It was Celeste. But these were not songs she had ever released. Somehow, her voice had survived her disappearance, embedded in music that climbed the charts. And no one could explain how it had gotten there. As D4vd's singles began to dominate playlists, the whispers about the mysterious female voice grew louder. Casual listeners admired the haunting harmonies, but longtime followers of Celeste felt a chill every time they heard the background vocals. They remembered her tone too well, the subtle cracks in her delivery, the way her breath lingered between notes. It was uncanny, almost identical, and yet these were melodies that had never been released before. Online forums and fan groups lit up with comparisons, with users posting side-by-side audio clips of Celeste's old songs and D4vd's new tracks. The similarities were too precise to dismiss. For many, it felt as though she had somehow returned, not in person, but as a voice echoing through music she never agreed to be part of. At first, some theorized that the tracks might have been a tribute, a way for D4vd to honor a missing artist whose potential had been cut short. Others speculated that it was the result of digital manipulation, that producers had sampled her old recordings without credit. But as more songs were released, each containing fragments of her unmistakable tone, the theories turned darker. These weren't simply recycled clips from her public uploads. There were subtle nuances, phrases, unfinished breaths, and tones that no one had ever heard before. It suggested access to something private, something she had never shared online. Investigators began to pay attention when fans compiled hours of evidence, layering Celeste's known works with the disputed tracks. In one chorus, her voice soared higher than anything she had ever publicly released, as though it came from a rehearsal rather than a finished song. In another, faint background noise hinted at the hum of an unfamiliar room, not the small bedroom where she had recorded her early music. These tiny details raised disturbing questions about the origins of the samples. If they weren't from her official releases, where had they come from? Meanwhile, D4vd remained silent. He gave no interviews addressing the rumors, no statements clarifying whether the vocals were intentional collaborations or chance resemblances. His silence only deepened the unease. And yet his career continued to rise. Each release gained millions of streams, pushing him into the spotlight. For fans of Celeste, though, the success carried a bitter taste. To them, it wasn't just music climbing the charts, it was the stolen voice of a woman who had disappeared, whispering clues from within songs that the world was dancing to without realizing the shadows hidden in the sound. The growing tension around D4vd's music pushed online investigators to dig deeper into the origins of the haunting vocals. What started as fan curiosity soon turned into a full-scale digital investigation. Users skilled in audio engineering began stripping away the instrumentals from the tracks, isolating the female voice buried beneath the layers of production. The result was unsettling. When the background vocals were played alone, they carried the exact imperfections that made Celeste's recordings unique. A breath cut short, the faint sound of her swallowing between lines, the quiver in her final notes. These weren't polished samples taken from public songs. They felt raw, almost as though someone had accessed her private practice sessions. Curiosity turned to alarm when metadata from leaked production files began circulating in online communities. Some of the timestamps dated weeks after Celeste had disappeared, raising questions about how her voice could have been captured at that time. Even more suspicious, fragments of unreleased songs that Celeste had once teased online were discovered in the layered harmonies of D4vd's tracks. The pieces matched demo files that had only ever existed on her personal computer. Somehow, parts of her digital archive had been extracted and repurposed, transformed into chart-topping choruses that no one could explain. As speculation mounted, connections began to surface between Celeste's disappearance and the production team working with D4vd. A cloud storage account linked to one of the producers contained audio samples identical to those found in Celeste's unreleased files. Though no direct link tied D4vd himself to the account, the overlap was too strong to ignore. Investigators quietly began to examine whether her disappearance had been more than a tragic accident, whether someone in the industry had deliberately silenced her while exploiting her greatest gift. Public reaction was divided. Some fans insisted it was all coincidence, that the resemblance in the vocals was exaggerated by grief and online obsession. Others, however, believed the evidence spoke for itself. For those who had listened to Celeste for years, the voice was unmistakable, and the timing of the recordings was impossible to dismiss. What had once been dismissed as rumor now carried the weight of a chilling possibility that her absence was directly connected to the sudden rise of another artist, and that her stolen voice was the only trace left to prove what had happened in the months after she disappeared. Months after Celeste's disappearance, the mystery took a grim turn when two hikers exploring a dense woodland area stumbled upon human remains. The discovery was horrifying in its stillness, a shallow resting place hidden beneath fallen leaves and scattered branches. Authorities were called immediately, and within days, dental records confirmed what many had feared but struggled to believe. It was Celeste. News of her death spread quickly, shaking those who had followed her music and those who had fought online to prove her voice had been stolen. The confirmation that she had been gone for months made the presence of her voice in new songs all the more disturbing. The investigators who arrived at the scene noted more than just her body. Among the damp soil and decayed leaves lay a small, battered audio recorder. Though weather damaged, it still contained fragments of sound when examined in the lab. The recordings were chilling, raw, incomplete takes of Celeste singing alone, her voice echoing with vulnerability. Some files were cut off abruptly, as if stopped mid-performance, while others captured her humming softly before breaking into verses that no one had ever heard before. They weren't the polished tracks fans remembered online. These were intimate, private moments of creation. Forensic analysts soon confirmed what her fans had long suspected: the samples used in D4vd's songs matched the unreleased recordings on that device. The presence of the recorder opened up more unsettling questions. Why had it been buried near her body? Who had taken it from her? And how had its contents made their way into the music industry? The link between her disappearance and the music that had launched another artist's career grew harder to deny. Investigators theorized that whoever was responsible for her fate had not only silenced her life, but also preserved her art, twisting it into something they could exploit. The public response was explosive. Media outlets that had ignored her case now plastered her face across headlines, highlighting the eerie trail of her voice. Fans who once celebrated D4vd's rising stardom flooded his platforms with outrage, demanding answers. The industry, meanwhile, scrambled to distance itself from the growing scandal. But the truth was already seeping out. Celeste had been found, yet her presence lingered most strongly in the very songs that had overshadowed her disappearance, leaving the world with a haunting reminder that her story was far from finished. The investigation that followed Celeste's discovery shifted from a missing person case to a chilling examination of exploitation within the music industry. The recorder found near her body became the centerpiece of the inquiry. Every file on it was analyzed, and the matches to D4vd's released tracks were undeniable. Experts demonstrated how her voice had been cut, altered, and layered into the songs that had propelled him to global recognition. While no direct evidence placed D4vd at the scene of her death, the chain of connections between his production team and the stolen material grew impossible to ignore. The more investigators uncovered, the more it seemed that her disappearance and his sudden rise were intertwined. The producers involved denied wrongdoing, insisting that the files had been acquired legally through old collaborations or sample libraries. Yet gaps in their stories made it clear that something was being concealed. Behind the polished surface of fame, a darker reality was taking shape. The tragedy of Celeste's end was no longer a hidden story whispered in online forums. It was now a public scandal unraveling in front of millions. Her voice had become both evidence of a crime and a haunting presence that refused to fade. As the truth circulated, public opinion split sharply. Some of D4vd's supporters argued that he was being unfairly targeted, that he might not have known the origins of the samples used in his songs. Others believed that ignorance was impossible, pointing out how distinct Celeste's voice was and how often it appeared in his most successful tracks. Social media campaigns demanded justice, while conspiracy theories flourished, speculating about who in the industry had orchestrated the theft of her music. The uncertainty only fueled the sense of dread surrounding the case. In the end, no single person was convicted of harming Celeste. The official story left unanswered questions, gaps that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Her death was ruled suspicious but unresolved, a tragedy without closure. Still, her influence endured. Fans who had once been silenced by indifference now elevated her songs, ensuring her work would not be forgotten. The haunting truth remained: her voice had been taken from her, reshaped into something that profited others. Even in death, Celeste's sound lived on, not as a legacy she chose but as a ghostly reminder of the shadows behind fame and the price of a voice that was too powerful to be left unheard.